Good afternoon, everyone. My name is We are very delighted today to host this talk, and a good friend of mine, Mark Getsemanian, is ready to present the findings of his PhD dissertation. And I'm going to read Varak's short bio. Keep in mind that the first part of his bio is going to change in a month because he's going to defend his dissertation in a month's time from now. But still, as of now, Varak Getsemanian is a PhD candidate at the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He's an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Armenia, teaching courses on the Middle Eastern history. He has been teaching here for 3 years already. 2 years. His articles appeared in the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and the International Journal of Middle East Studies, along with many chapters in edited volumes. His edited book with Emre Can Dağlıoğlu, Memoirs of Boğaz Shadik, a revolutionary from Baku to Marseille, is forthcoming with Michigan State University Press. Getsemani is currently working on his monograph, provisionally titled Armenian Constitutionalism in the late Ottoman Empire, between reform and crisis. So the format is as follows. So Barbara will speak for some 40 minutes or so, and then there will be a Q&A session. So, what is yours?
Thank you, Professor Dematos, and for that introduction. Thank you all for coming, finding the time to come to this talk. So this talk is part of a larger project, so I would appreciate if you have any suggestions, comments, critiques at the end. We can discuss it in the Q&A session. So what I'm going to do today is try to suggest a general framework for understanding late Ottoman Armenian social and political history, or social politics. So before we actually go into the Ottoman Empire, we actually should come to the middle of the 19th century when this movement for constitutionalism was getting widespread in European states and countries, because by the 19th century, constitution was seen as a marker of modernity and enlightenment. So these are some examples of countries and states that adopted constitution throughout the 1850s and the 1860s. So in this global moment of constitutionalism, the Ottoman Empire was not an exception. For those of you who have taken classes on Ottoman history, you might know that during the early 19th century, there was a set of reforms that we refer to as the Tanzimat reforms, which was this set of cultural, educational, social, political, and military reforms and improvements that the empire was undertaking in order to be more, let's say, modern, and in order to counter any European intervention or any European threat. So the Ottoman movement of constitutionalism actually starts in the late 1850s, and particularly after the Reform Edict of 1856, after the Crimean War. So throughout this period, we have examples of different constitutions, or different, let's say, mini-constitutions in Tunisia, which was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, and Mount Lebanon in 1860, and more importantly for our purposes today, the three major religious communities in the empire, which were referred to as Milites, the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews, actually received their, let's say, communal constitutions in the early 1860s. So when we actually zoom in on the Armenian National Constitution, I'm not going to go into the details of its the drafting sessions, but what we need to know for our purposes today is that the first drafts of this constitution were actually written between 1857 until 1860. It was ratified in 1860 by the Ottoman authorities. However, it was revised and edited and finally took its shape in 1863. So what we should bear in mind is that the Armenian experience in this period was part of this larger imperial, regional, and even global context of constitutional movements. So the case of Mount Lebanon, the autonomous region of Mount Lebanon, which received some form of an autonomous regulation in 1860, 1861, was really appealing to the Armenians, and I can go into the details during the Q&A session how this was actually reflected. So this is just the cover of the Armenian National Constitution, or in Armenian as Constitution. So some of the research questions that actually drove this research were how was the Constitution really implemented in the empire, in the provinces, in the capital? Second, what did constitutionalism actually mean for Armenians living in different provinces, and how did they adapt to the changes? How did the Ottoman provinces experience this constitution? Who were its practitioners, and how did it affect society? And finally, what kind of problems the Armenians were trying to address within this constitutional framework. So we can actually divide the history of the Constitution into two major phases. The first phase, or proto-constitutional phase, between 1847 and 1863. This is relatively well covered in the scholarship and the literature, so I'm not going to go much into the details. but it suffices to say that it started when two major councils under the Patriarchy of Armenia in Constantinople were formed in 1847, the Religious Council, the Civic Council, and then we have the Central Educational Council in 1853, and finally we have the ratification of the Constitution itself in 1863. So when the Constitution was actually ratified by the Ottoman authorities, there was the creation of this Armenian National Assembly, Asgain and Tamajolo Ayots, with legislative powers, and then the two councils, the religious and the civic, with executive powers. So to give you an idea, sorry, I don't have the English translation of this graph, but to give you a rough idea of how the administration actually looked like, you have the patriarch, and then the National Assembly, the administration, the civic council, the religious council, and then the sub-commissions, and then the provincial administration, which will be the kind of the bulk of the second part of this talk. So in theory, the Constitution was supposed to neutralize different spiritual, political, and ecclesiastical centers. So in the empire, or in the broader region, you have the Armenian Patriarchy located in Istanbul. You have two different Catholicos in Assis, the Canadian Catholicosate, and the Catholicosate of Akhtamar, the spiritual center Echmiadzin, and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. So if you read the text of the Constitution, it was supposed to centralize all the power in the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople and neutralize any rival ecclesiastical centers in the provinces or even Echmiadzin. So this is really in theory. This is just another picture that I found in one of the periodicals in 1910, showing how Armenians are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Constitution in the Armenian hospital in Istanbul. So what next? So when we actually know the story, we know this much of the Armenian Constitution. However, we don't really know how it was implemented, or was it implemented at all. So this is why I'm saying, in theory, the Constitution had to actually centralize all the power in the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople. However, in reality, things were much more different and much more difficult. So I suggest actually looking at Constitution, especially the Armenian Constitution here, not as a simply legal text, but as a sociological object that is formed with different social tensions, social relations, and to see as a pattern of social formation. So I'm moving from this legal interpretation of Constitution to a more social history of the Constitution. So what I argue in my dissertation, in my work, is that 1863 was a turning point for the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire because it actually established the foundations of what I call the constitutional order. So the constitutional order itself, after 1863, produced or introduced a communal frame. By communal frame, I mean a system of relations whereby Armenians were shaped their expectations, their behavior, their political rights and social belongings. So in a way, it actually formed a structure through which Armenians could express their daily experiences, their daily interactions. So what this means is that the Constitution really created new social and political terminologies. For example, after 1860s or after 1863, we see the proliferation of terms such as justice, national welfare, popular representation, popular will. So these are all new terminologies that actually come with the inauguration of this constitutional system. More importantly, the Constitution itself was seen by the Armenians as a marker of progress, as a marker of loyalty to the empire, and finally, as a means for legitimacy. And this is a very important point that will have important consequences for the later history. So, in other words, the constitutional order itself put the new rules of the game. After 1863, there was this constitutional system that the Armenians had to partake in. And And the next slides will talk how, let's say, Armenians address local, communal, and imperial issues using this constitutional framework and constitutional system. One of the most, let's say, interesting and fascinating aspects of the system was that if you've read Ottoman history in the 19th century, with the Tanzimat reforms, there was a shift from the imperial palace, where the power was concentrated for almost 400 years, to the imperial bureaucracy, with this new measures and with this new improvement. So this is a development that is reflected or is parallel in the Armenian case as well. After the opening of the National Assembly, the power actually shifts from the Patriarch himself, or the Patriarchy as an institution, to the National Assembly. So after 1863, we see new mechanisms and institutions of control, auditing, accountability, and these are just some publications from the Patriarchy about its operations, its constitutional operations. So who were these, let's say, practitioners of the Constitution, the practitioners of the constitutional government? So the professionalization of the Patriarchy in the 19th century actually obliged to bring people who have some form of governance experience. So many Armenians who were working in the Ottoman bureaucracy, in the Ottoman imperial administration, ended up joining, let's say, the National Assembly and becoming what they called at the time communal deputies or askarniya eskopas. So a lot of these Armenian Istanbul-based elites became the communal deputies after 1863. And if you read their, let's say, newspaper articles, their publications, or the minutes of the National Assembly, you can see how constitutionalists placed education, rationality, progress, and the rule of law at the core of their reform agenda. So for them, constitutional rule was equivalent with reform, was tantamount to, let's say, improving the Armenian community. So it's not really a coincidence that after 1863, we see a major campaign of quote-unquote civilizing and enlightening the provincial Armenians. So we have a lot of, let's say, philanthropic associations, educational organizations, weekend lectures, fundraising campaigns to actually, quote-unquote, assist and civilize or modernize the provincial Armenians who were seen by these people as backward, as not really modern yet. So these are just some pictures of the most important pioneers of constitutionalism. So we now actually come to how the Constitution was actually experienced first in Istanbul. So the church committees, or in Armenian the Talagahor, which are small parish boards, actually were the smallest constitutional body. So on the right you see a map of Istanbul with the Armenian churches in each neighborhood. So the small church committees furnished the foundations of this new constitutional system. They were regulators of neighborhood affairs, organizers of local elections, and finally monitors of neighborhood schools. And I will talk more about these points in a minute. So how did these church committees actually operate in this new system? So they really became these small power centers in their neighborhoods. And many people used these church committees to actually address issues such as marriages, divorce, inter- and intra-communal tensions, church renovations, school issues. So everything that really relates to the community were regulated and organized by these church committees. And more interestingly, they became the regulators of public and communal morality. This is an aspect of this larger problem that needs more research, but from the documents that we have, we can actually see how the church committees were really careful not to let or allow people to have illegal marriages, illegal divorces, or get married twice. So in a way, they functioned as these regulators of communal and public morality. So these are just some examples of the minutes and the archives that have survived from these church committees that are stored in the Nouvarian Library in Paris. So you can see the stamp of each church committee. So these are just documents addressing different issues with different signatories. So the major question, however, is, did provincial constitutionalism really work? So, or did it actually succeed? So this is a major question that our scholarship, our literature, or Armenian history has not really addressed. So what we can actually say from the outset is that the implementation of the constitution in the provinces became a problem. So from 1863 onwards, we see major problems in the provinces. And to give you just a quick overview of what these problems actually look like, I'll focus on the province of Sebastia, or the province of Sivas, which was a major, let's say, Armenian center, one of the biggest provinces in the empire where the Armenians resided. And it really became the site for early constitutional struggles between different factions of the community. Interestingly, the province of Sebastia also became what I would call a rehearsal ground, where many of the problems that were experienced in the 1860s gave the Patriarchate some form of a precedence to actually resolve later issues in different provinces. So when we look at the history of Sebastia from this perspective, we actually come to the orders of a local election in 1863, 1864. So the Patriarchate actually ordered that local elections be held in the summer of 1863 and 64 by forming a committee for the implementation of the Constitution. So I'm not mistaken. So this is a map of where the province of Sebastia actually lies. So it's relatively close to Istanbul, which is why it became this early site for constitutional rule. And this is a more, let's say, zoomed in focus on the province itself, with the city of Sebastia and other major centers. So this is just an example, let's say, from the town of Toka, from the the Committee for the Implementation of the Constitution, on the number of male taxpayers registered for each church and in each district. Remember that constitutionalism among Ottoman Armenians was a very male-oriented or male-dominated system, so only male taxpayers could be elected in the National Assembly, could be elected into the church committees. And this is just a reflection of that. So from the outset, there was a strong backlash against the Patriarchate for implementing constitutional rules. So there were a lot of notables in the city of, or in the province of Sebastia, notables who are referred in the Armenian literature as Ağaner, Ereveliler, İşkanler, Çorbacıner, Hocabaşıner, Mahadesiner. So these are all different categories of notables who operated in Sebastia. So once they actually saw that the Patriarchate was introducing constitutional rule, what we see in the early 1860s is the emergence of what I would call the Provincial Alliance, or a provincial coalition between these notables on the one hand and the local religious class, the prelate or the senior priest. For example, the arashnik of a diocese in a locale was considered a senior clergyman. So what these people actually did after 1863 was they mobilized their social networks, whether it was the schools, people who migrated to Istanbul for seasonal work, or their connections to the Ottoman imperial officials, to local tribal chiefs, Kurdish tribal chiefs, to actually remain in power. So for them, constitutionalism was a challenge at first, so they quickly realized that they could really preserve their interest by forming the coalition and by using the language of constitutionalism to actually go against the Patriarchate. So this is a very important point. they were not really opposing the constitution as such, but they were actually using the terms and the notions that the constitutionalism introduced to actually counter the directives and the strategies of the patriarchy. So in a nutshell, for these notables and the senior clergymen in the provinces, reform was okay. They accepted reform as long as it was on their own terms and not on the patriarchy's terms. So this is just another example of a petition from the province of Sivas, which I have translated, and it actually shows the language or how they adapted to the language of the constitutionalism. So I'm quoting, "Therefore, we consider it our current duty to declare to the respectable assembly, the National Assembly, that the people demand the complete implementation of the Constitution, and if there is any obstacle or difficulty in its implementation, again, it is solely the National Assembly that can see that obstacle or difficulty and accordingly order the Civic Council to do the same. Any measure beyond this legal or legitimate process is unacceptable, and the Patriarch, the deputies, and the communal administration are obliged to follow this. We ask from your respectable assembly to consider this declaration and to have the wisdom of keeping the community free from anarchism by removing all the obstacles against the implementation of the Constitution, to promote the true welfare and progress of the nation. Deputy ministers or misters, the nation expects nothing of you but the Constitution and its implementation." This is from 1873. So this is a clear example of how these notables or their social networks were using the language of constitutionalism to actually argue against the patriarchy. So from my research, I was actually able to identify around 10 or 15 major notable households in the province of Sebastia, and this is a partial list, which I'm not going to go through. So these people, these big families, were the members of what I call the Provincial Alliance. So when the Constitution was actually implemented in the provinces, these notables used this constitutional system to legitimize their local interests and local power. So what actually resulted is they found themselves in this constitutional apparatus by becoming provincial deputies, by becoming members of the provincial constitutional institution. So they integrated themselves into the constitutional order because that was the only legitimate framework that the patriarchy now recognized. And with their integration into the system, they really made this constitutional order impenetrable, impervious to people who challenged them. So anyone who were coming from outside or coming from the town itself, which I refer here as external and internal challengers, they did not have the necessary power to challenge the whole of the notables on this constitutional system. So as a result, they received imperial privileges. So once they were becoming members of these constitutional institutions, they enjoyed the privileges from the Ottoman authorities. And this was really a convenient, let's say, modus operandi for the Ottoman authorities as well. So the notables kept the communal status quo unchangeable. And as a result, they actually enjoyed privileges and benefits from the Ottoman state. So this is the picture, sorry I couldn't find a better quality picture, of the local prelate, the Archbishop of Sebastia, Bedros Tamizcan, which was a major, let's say, power broker in the town itself, and had a strong alliance with the notables or with the families that we just saw the family names. So these families allied with the prelate Bedros Tamizcan to actually obstruct anyone coming from Constantinople or anyone who was trying to challenge their power in Sebastia itself from attaining membership to these constitutional institutions. Another example of how notables mobilized their social networks of migrant workers, people in Sebastia, to actually protest against the patriarchy so that one of their senior priests could actually return back to Sebastia. Another petition from 1868. So as you can see, the stamps are the stamps of the major notables, at least on the first two lines, and then the stamp of the vice prelate, Petros himself, actually petitioning the Patriarchy, saying we want our priest, Archbishop Garabet, to return to Sebastia. Even Ottoman authorities were involved in these constitutional struggles. So the religious council, for example, of Sebastia is writing to the Ottoman authorities in Ottoman Turkish saying they want the Archbishop Garabet back in Sebastia because all the residents of the city, all the notables of the city actually love him, they want him back. So finally, when the Patriarchy was experiencing such problems in the provinces, we have a lot of documents about constitutional violations, frauds, electoral violations. So the Patriarchy was actually obliged to send inspectors or investigators into the provinces to actually investigate these violations and punish the people who were behind it. However, the Patriarchy soon enough realized that no notable support actually meant no reform. So it was in a very weak position to destroy the power of these provincial alliances, and it actually compromised starting in 1873 and actually recognized the notables as legitimate practitioners of constitutional rule, because only by integrating these notables could the Patriarchy actually succeed in bringing some form of reform to schools, to churches, to the community at large. However, this is not really, let's say, a success story when we come to the later parts of the 19th and early parts of the 20th century. And this is what I refer to as the crisis of the constitutional order starting in 1888. And why? One of the major reasons is we have a major change in the Ottoman administration. This man, Sultan Abdülhamid II, becomes the Ottoman Sultan in 1876, and we have a radical shift in the Ottoman administration, in the Ottoman domestic as well as foreign policies. So if we want to, let's say, give an overview of what the Armenian regime started looking like in the 1880s, is he abrogated the Ottoman parliament in 1878, so he really shut down the institution that's supposed to represent different Ottoman ethno-religious groups. He implemented new measures of Islamic Sunni orthopraxy, started dismantling the Tanzimat institution that provided some form of political participation to different groups. And as far as the Armenians were concerned, the empowerment of Kurdish tribal militias and local Muslim elites really worsened the situation, the socioeconomic situation of Armenians, mostly in the eastern provinces. So as a result, the Armenian regime was much more assertive, radical, and a repressive central state. And as we know from our, let's say, conventional Armenian history, it is against this background that we have the formation of Armenian revolutionary parties, the three parties that you have the emblems here. So I'm not going to go into the details of the creation of these parties, but what I would like to do is to actually reflect on how the establishment of these revolutionary parties was another, let's say, reason why the constitutional order was actually declining and it eventually collapsed. So when we keep in mind how the notables really made or kept this constitutional system impenetrable for other, let's say, groups, other social groups, other political groups, the revolutionary parties themselves became alternative avenues for political mobilization. So a lot of disenfranchised Armenians in the provinces who were not really, who didn't really have a chance to become a constitutional member, actually ended up joining these revolutionary parties. So with the creation of these clandestine committees, revolutionary committees, we see the emergence or the creation of a new order. So this is an order that I call in my dissertation as the radical order. So we have the constitutional order that existed since the 1860s, and now a completely new system, a new configuration that I call the radical order, which was a set of completely new, novel, and even radical institutions. For example, the provincial constitutional assemblies were not really chosen by the revolutionaries. They established new revolutionary taxes, revolutionary tribunals, armed mobile bands, struggling networks for weapons. So these were the new institutions that the revolutionaries were bringing into the Ottoman Armenian life. And one of the major reasons for their success in actually challenging this constitutional system was that they operated outside the, let's say, parameters or the contours of this constitutional system. So from 1860s until the early 1890s, everyone who tried to challenge these notables, these senior clergymen, tried to do it by using the same constitutional methods and the systems and the laws. So that's why they failed, because the notables had a strong grip on the system itself. So what the revolutionaries did was they moved outside of the system and tried to create a completely new social order, political order that was independent of the constitutional system. So for these revolutionaries, the constitutional system was not really a solution to the let's say, the predicament of Ottoman Armenians, but was part of the problem itself. So even though constitutionalists in the 1860s saw this system as, let's say, an antidote to the social, economic, educational problems of the Armenians, for the revolutionaries, the constitutional system was part of the problem, was a collaborator with the Ottoman regime, and was actually something that needs to be discarded. So there was a strong anti-constitutional rhetoric in the publications of the revolutionaries in their major newspapers, Trosha, Armenia, Hınçak. So you can find a lot of articles that are attacking these constitutionalists, the patriarch, the provincial notables. And this shift is also very important because it shows us how these people, these notables who were described as reformists, as constitutionalists, as local leaders, as local rulers in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, now in the early 1890s and 1900s, are being described as repressive collaborators and national traitors. So the entire social and political terminology of describing these people is being changed by the revolutionaries. And this is something that we still see in Armenian conventional historiography. When we talk about these local ishkhans or yerevelis or notables, we still describe them in the same terms that the revolutionaries used at the time. So we don't really deconstruct what these revolutionaries or why these revolutionaries were using those same terms, and how is it that people who were local leaders only 20 years back are now becoming national traitors. This is a caricature from a periodical published by the Patriarchy Party. It's called Aptak, Slab, and it's a caricature that I really love because it really captures the essence of this anti-constitutionalism among the revolutionaries. You can see the kind of the Armenian peasant, which was the major manpower of these revolutionaries, actually sweeping the floor of the patriarchy, the notables, people who were kind of tax farmers, big merchants, or people who were loan sharks. So a lot of these notables were also loan sharks, So he's actually sweeping the floor of these people, and then there's a kind of the sun rising with a new dawn on the Armenian community. So by the 1890s, we actually go from having these people as let's say, communal leaders or people who represented the community to actually this. So this is what communal politics would look like starting in the 1890s. So how did the Ottoman state actually react to this? When we bear in mind how the Armenian regime was radically different from the Tanzimat period, how did the Ottoman authorities react? So first, the Armenian revolutionaries, with their different operations and activities, destabilized the communal status quo. This is pretty clear. So by actually challenging the communal status quo, they jeopardized the communal leadership of these provincial notables. So as long as these provincial notables could not really maintain some form of a communal status quo, the modus operandi that existed between them and the Ottoman, let's say, administration was actually undermined. So there was no more of this modus operandi between the notables and the Ottoman authorities. So starting in the 1890s, we have a lot of Ottoman reports from ministries, from local offices, actually showing the fear and anxiety of these local administrators, the Ottoman imperial administrators, fearing revolutionary infiltration into these constitutional systems. So they want to maintain the notables on the very institutions that governed the community for almost 4 decades. So as a result, the Ottoman administration becomes much more radical in actually keeping its favorite candidates, its favorite appointees to the very institutions of the constitutional order. To actually say it in other words, we have a lot of violation and dismissal of constitutional practices by the Ottoman authorities itself. For example, let's say when the term of one notable, let's say, ended at a certain period, we have a lot of documents saying, or coming from the imperial palace saying, I want this, let's say, person to stay on the committee, to stay on this constitutional council, even though his term expired, because that may actually provide an opening for the revolutionaries to infiltrate to these committees. So what we see is a very flagrant violation and dismissal of constitutional practices, which itself puts the constitutional order in question, because this was the entire, let's say, raison d'etre of this system, and by violating the laws, the stipulations of the Constitution, you are putting the constitutional order under further pressure. So what we have is, by the 1890s and early 1900s, the constitutional system was under extreme pressure from below, from the revolutionaries who were attacking people discursively and physically, actually killing them, assassinating them, these notables, and from above, the government was trying to actually preserve some form of a status quo and keep these notables in power. So from the 1890s onwards, we see an increasing involvement of Ottoman authorities into Armenian communal affairs, something that was unprecedented before. So we have a lot of police investigations, reports on National Assembly, spy reports on the Patriarch, on the let's say chairman of the National Assembly. So for the Ottoman system itself, the constitutional order really became a liability. It was not really a system that could hold the community together, but it was becoming a liability that needed to be actually discarded. So after the massacres of 1894, 1896, when the entire, let's say, material, communal, cultural, and economic foundations of the community were destroyed in many ways, in 1896, Abdul Hamid decides to abrogate the National Constitution and ban the meetings of the National Assembly. So when we put these kind of ideas into graphic terms, from 1860 until 1896, we have the Sultan actually having some form of a political relationship with the National Assembly, the Civic Council, and the Patriarch.
through the intermediaries of these two institutions, and after 1896 until 1908, when the National Assembly is banned, there's no constitution to regulate or check the powers of the Patriarchy. The Sultan is directly talking to the Patriarchy or communicating with the Patriarchy. To conclude with some final remarks, and this is the Patriarch Malaki al-Armenian, who became the Armenian Patriarch in 1896, and this is when, during his tenure, the National Assembly was banned, the Constitution was abrogated. So, what we can conclude from these few slides is that constitutionalism, at least for the Armenian case, was not only an intellectual current, an intellectual debate from the 1860s until the 1870s, but it was a vibrant political culture, it was a vibrant social experience that really furnished the foundations of the modern Armenian nation, and later on, the Armenian diaspora. For those of you who were born and raised, or for those of you who visited Armenian communities in the diaspora, this social system, the social configuration is still existing among these communities. So this is just an overview of how it was started and what were some of the changes that it brought about. So after 1896, we have a radical, let's say, reconfiguration of Ottoman Armenian politics, when the institutional character of community-state relation was changed and became on an individual basis. So when you don't have a National Assembly, when you don't have a constitution, the Patriarch actually re-emerged as the only and the primary interlocutor with the Ottoman state. Remember, this was not something that we saw during the Tanzimat, but after 1896, Malaki al-Armenian really became the only interlocutor with the Ottoman Sultan. So as a result, we have two concurrent communal systems, a declining constitutional order until 1896, and a more militarizing and rising radical order as kind of a counterpart of this system. And when Abdulhamid really repressed or became a much more aggressive sultan with a much more aggressive internal policy, he really played into the hands of the revolutionaries by undermining the constitutional system, by dismantling the Tanzimat institutions, and by actually limiting the political participation of Ottoman Armenians. And as a result, many saw the revolutionaries as a viable alternative to political participation. And finally, it was only with the 1908 Young Turk Revolution that these two systems, the radical order and the constitutional order, were synchronized and really produced a new coherent system of communal governance that still kind of exists, as I said, in Armenian communities in the diaspora today. Thank you.
Please lead the discussion, so I don't need to come there. So questions to work. Or let me, yes, please.
Thank you for the nice presentation. First of all, the question is, I didn't really understand the causes for creation of national, let's say, parties. Were they a vehicle to oppose the local elites, or were they a vehicle to oppose the central government? Or both, maybe?
Well, to answer...
So what was the motivation behind it?
The short answer would be both. So if you look at if you try to understand from the perspective of these, let's say, nationalist or party founders, for them, the system that integrated the local elites into the Ottoman government was itself part of the problem. So not only were they opposing let's say, the Sultan himself, but they were opposing what they would call the proxies or the cronies of the Sultan himself. So the ideology that they were putting forward supposed kind of a confrontation with the local elites as well. Because for them, the local elites who were loan sharks, who were actually exploiting the Armenian peasantry, exploiting the Armenian villagers, was part of the social and economic system that really brought the Armenians to that predicament. So for them, the local elites were also part of the problem that they needed to actually just remove. But I wouldn't really say that was their only target. Of course, the Ottoman system as such was the major problem, and on a kind of provincial level, these local elites were seen as the kind of reflection of that big problem on a local level.
So would you say that the initial reason they were created was what actually? Like, what were they trying to respond to?
I guess I would pose the question in another way, because if you have in mind the creation of the Patriarchy and the Dutch Constitution, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, their founders were coming from the Caucasus, so they were bringing with them a lot of, let's say, radical ideas that they were exposed to with the Russian, let's say, populist movement, the Russian anarchist movement. However, the problem is, why did the Ottoman Armenians decide to join these organizations? And that's a problem that needs a different kind of research, because we don't really know who the members of these parties were, apart from a few local elites, apart from the founders. So we don't have much information on, let's say, the average militant, the average revolutionary who was working in these provinces. To kind of answer your question more directly, the reason why, let's say, Ottoman Armenians decided to join is, first, they didn't see other alternatives, because the communal system that they were part of was not really conducive to their social welfare. So for them, they tried to find other alternatives. And the revolutionaries gave them that alternative by actually creating these clandestine networks of weapons smuggling, of extortion, of revolutionary taxes that really gave the community some form of, let's say, self-defense measures that it lacked.
Thanks.
Okay, first of all, thank you for this comprehensive presentation, and it covered a broad, wide time lapse, so therefore it can't be that comprehensive. I mean, there are questions which are mentioned regarding, like this one. First of all, I was always wondering, why would a constitutional system be implemented for a community rather than a whole nation? Yeah, you brought examples, for instance, Canada, also Hungary, so on and so forth. They're all constitutions implemented on a single country within its borders, unlike this community-shaped or community-defined constitutions. My question regards the specificity. How far could it go? Where it ended? And ultimately, on one hand, this is a modernizing attempt, but within a community. But looking from an imperial perspective, it's questionable whether it's implementing, whether it's modernizing or not. Specifically, if we take the position of the ruling, the majority Muslims, yeah, because they didn't have anything like a constitution. Okay, maybe my question became too blurred, and maybe it should be divided.
There are very important questions that I didn't really go into the details of this talk. So the way I understood it is there are three different questions. Why communal constitution? What did it really achieve in a way? And why not, let's say, an imperial and all-encompassing constitution? First, were these communal constitutions, the Jews, the Greeks, the Rum, and the Armenians, it was not, let's say, an Ottoman favor to these communities. The Ottoman authorities were not doing a favor to these communities. So in, let's say, Turkish mainstream historiography, these, let's say, what they call a regulation or a nizam, are usually described as favors to these communities. Look how the Ottoman, let's say, authorities were benevolent. They were giving these communities internal administrative rights and practices. That was not really the case. So one of the major, let's say, driving force behind these communal institutions, and specifically for the Armenians, was to actually curb the powers or limit the power of what the Ottoman statesmen at the time referred to as the obscurantists, and we have the same word in Armenian, Havaramit, the obscurantist religious classes. So they wanted to actually professionalize and in some way secularize the Armenian Patriarchy. That's one. And the reason for that is great power intervention and great power pressure, especially after the Crimean War in 1856, with the ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1856. So the Ottomans were actually obliged to improve some aspects of their internal communal administration. So that's two. Third, retrospectively, it's now easy to say the Ottomans should not have done this or that, but for them, the religious classes were, at least in theory, were much more difficult to be governed than the secular classes. But as I tried to show, that was not really the case. That was not really the case. Retrospectively, the Ottoman notables really became a major, let's say, power broker that were not easily handled neither by the Patriarchy nor the Ottoman authorities. So that's true. Fourth, the driving, let's say, ideology behind the Tanzimat reforms was centralizing and modernizing the empire, right? So the Tanzimat statesmen actually saw the constitution or the constitutional system as a junior partner of their reforms. So for them, if all of the power was centralized in the Patriarchy, and the Patriarchy really became the intermediary between the community, the sole intermediary between the community and the state, then that aspect of the Tanzimat, as far as the Armenians were concerned, was achieved. So in a way, the centralization by the Patriarchy was part of this larger project of the centralization by the imperial authorities. That's fourth. Fifth, the Patriarchy had to find, let's say, more subtle ways, because if you're a state, you have the military power, you have the means of violence to actually destroy the power of local notables or other, let's say, local networks that oppose your centralization project. And this is what the Ottomans did in the 1840s when they destroyed some of the Kurdish, let's say, provincial chiefs or emirs in the east. And as a result, they brought these kind of territories closer to Ottoman rule. This is not what the Patriarchy could have done, because the Patriarchy does not own an army, so it had to find more accommodating ways to actually centralize its power. And that's why the Patriarchy quickly realized that unless it had the support of these notables who controlled wealth, local networks, local access to imperial offices, the Patriarchy would not be successful in implementing reform. And finally, for your question about this all-encompassing Ottoman constitution, these constitutions or these communal models really gave the Ottoman state or provided the Ottoman state the opportunity to experiment with different forms of regulations. So when we come to 1876, a lot of the Armenian, let's say, pioneers of constitutionalism were involved in the drafting committee of the all-Ottoman Constitution of 1876. And that's why I said when the Ottoman Parliament was shut down in 1878, this is a parliament that's supposed to represent all ethno-religious communities. So they did have, let's say, an all-encompassing Ottoman Constitution in 1876, but it only lasted for 2 years. Okay. Does that answer the question in some ways?
You said that 1863 became a turning point, but I didn't get clearly how did the Constitution get adopted? Whether it was done by a referendum or Ottoman Parliament adopted it. How did it become a legal document?
Yes, the reason why I didn't cover that aspect is because it's relatively well known, and I apologize if I didn't go into the details. So, as I said, the idea of centralizing power or secularizing the patriarchy, secularizing the Ottoman imperial administration was part of the Tanzimat ideology, starting in the 1840s. So in 1847, we see the creation of these two councils, the Romakanjolo and the Kalakanjolo, that these institutions were the first instances of, let's say, proto-constitutional governance. And to answer your question more directly, there was this, let's say, class conflict between the wealthy Amiras of Istanbul, who conventionally appointed their favored candidate to the Patriarchy. So one of the most, let's say, powerful Amiras would actually suggest a name, and the others would actually agree on. This is how conventionally the election of the Patriarchy was done. So there was a lot of people from the artisan class, the merchant class, people who were coming, let's say, new intellectuals, people who were educated in Europe and France and Italy, who were actually exposed to the ideas of democratic governance, constitutional governance, popular will, popular representation. So these people were not really happy with the way things were run in the Patriarchy. So for them, this was a very, let's say, abusive system that can lead to abusive usage of patriarchal power. So in the 1850s, there was a lot of tension between the Amiras and the, let's say, the emerging intellectual, professional, and the artisan class. That's why I said starting 1857, after the Crimean War ended, the Ottoman administration actually allowed the Armenian communities, the Armenian community, to actually form a commission to start drafting what eventually would be the Armenian National Constitution. So it took actually 3 years for that committee to draft and bring the constitution to shape, because the Amiras were actually opposing, the Patriarch himself was opposing, and the Amiras, by virtue of their access to Ottoman, let's say, offices, because they were the people, they were the wealthy class who financed a lot of, let's say, Ottoman offices and Ottoman households. So they had access to these power networks. So it took the drafting committee 3 years and another 3 years, so overall 6 years to finalize the ratification of the Constitution. So in a nutshell, we can say class conflict, ideology, and a changing dynamics of the Ottoman, let's say, internal administration by the 1850s and 60s really pushed for constitutional governance. Yes.
Yes, so I'm trying to connect the topic to our modern day. So on April 24th, everyone addressed their community, international community, to the meeting with the President of Armenia in Turkey, and the question here is that, can we say that the attempts to use the Armenian religious structure in Turkey is the legacy of this formed religious authority to the period of formation of the Armenian constitutional order of Turkey, meaning that this helped future governments, for example, to not weaponize it, but turn it into a leverage and instrumentalize it in order to solve some future issues such as this.
They didn't have the Turkish government, you mean?
Yes, the Turkish government. So obviously I'm saying that the patriarch in this context is used as a symbol of trying to come up with a consensus or come around, negotiate, or talk out their focal points in the communication with the messenger. So I'm trying to understand whether this process helped to instrumentalize it.
That's a good question. I guess the way I would respond is the Patriarchy of Malaki Armenia from 1896 until 1908, I would say, set a precedence for what the Turkish government is doing, or how the Turkish government is conducting, let's say, business with the Armenian Patriarchy. So now, there is no Armenian Constitution in Turkey. There is no, let's say, secular national communal assembly. So in a way, the only interlocutor with the Turkish government is the Patriarch himself. So that's why it's really easy to weaponize or instrumentalize the Patriarch himself, because there is no checks and balances on the operations and activities of the Patriarch. Of course, there are some form of councils and ad hoc institutions that let's say, Istanbul Armenians put together for the election of the Patriarchy. But as an institutionalized system, it's only the Patriarch himself who is actually categorized as a government employee. So that also allows the Turkish government to actually weaponize, I'm not sure if weaponize is the right word, but instrumentalize the Patriarchy for its own, let's say, domestic and foreign policies.
Not that familiar with the topic, so perhaps it's a stupid question, but the Armenian Protestant and Catholic communities did factor into the Armenian Constitution, which was more just only a apostolic followers. How did they, I'm assuming they didn't have another constitution, but were they governed in a similar way, or did they kind of under the umbrella of the Supreme Court?
Well, 2 points. First, the Protestants and the Armenian Protestants and the Armenian Catholics come into this picture at least in the 1840s and the 1850s, and that was one of the reasons why the Patriarchy, or people who were pioneers of this constitutional movement, accelerated their efforts to have a constitution, because the Catholics and the Protestants were becoming new religious communities with recognized rights in the Ottoman Empire, but there were a lot of conversions from Apostolic Armenians to Catholicism or Protestantism, and that really impacted the community in terms of numbers, demographics, and in terms of schools, because a lot of Armenian children who went to Catholic schools, Protestant schools, eventually ended up converting and accepting Catholicism and Protestantism. As far as their internal administration, it was not as expensive, as institutionalized as the Armenian Apostolic, but we do see instances where there is some form of, let's say, cooperation between Catholics, Protestants, and Apostolic Armenians. So starting in the 1870s, late 1870s, there are associations that, at least in theory, encompass an all-Armenian identity for an all-Armenian, let's say, reform program. But when we actually come to the revolutionaries, that was really one of the novelties that they brought into this communal system, because for them, religious identities was not at the forefront of belonging. So the Ottoman system had been conventionally, traditionally, historically organized along religious differences and along religious lines. So the revolutionaries really transcended those religious identities, and you can find, let's say, an Armenian Catholic and an Armenian Protestant and an Armenian, let's say, Apostolic in the same revolutionary community. So that was really one of the radical changes that the revolutionaries were bringing, transcending these local religious identities and to actually have a more all-Armenian kind of facade for their operations. That's why the revolutionaries could actually claim that they were representing the entire Armenian nation. They were operating on behalf of the entire Armenian nation and not only for a apostolic Armenians.
mentioned that this was part of a larger constitutional movement. So is there any research on how this movement maybe set a precedent for Armenians living outside of the Ottoman Empire, like other communities, for example, like in Iran, that the movement started 40 years later and Armenians were quite active. So was this kind of an example for them? Is this unique in any way?
That's a good question, but before we actually come to Iran, in the 1830s, I'm not sure about the date, there was a similar regulation that the Russian authorities, imperial authorities, gave to Echmiadzin. It's called Poложение in Russian. So that was not really a constitution as such, but it was a document that tried to regulate or even restrict some of the activities of the Echmiadzin as a spiritual center. So that was in a way influential for Ottoman Armenians because they did see the Poложение as some form of a secularizing document that tried to curb the power of the ecclesiastical center. But of course, it had another trajectory, another history. As far as Iran is concerned, I would say the 1860s movement was not really impactful on the Armenians living in Iran, but because the revolutionaries had centers in Iran, in the Caucasus, and in the Ottoman Empire, where their trans-regional nature actually connected the struggle for a constitutional governance in the Ottoman Empire to the struggle for a constitutional governance in, let's say, in Iran. So for these revolutionary elites, unless you have a constitutional governance in all these empires, you cannot really achieve kind of political reform, or you cannot really demand your rights. So that's why, if you look at the history of the Iranian Iranian constitutional revolution in 1905, 1906, 1907, there's a widespread movement of constitutionalism, imperial constitutionalism in Russia, the 1905 revolution, and a few years later, 1908, the Young Turk Revolution. So these revolutions were kind of impacting each other in terms of ideas, and there was these trans-regional movements of militants going from one empire to the other, ideas going from Russia to Iran, from Iran to the Ottoman Empire.
Other questions? So, Mark, I have a few questions. So I'll just list them in case you don't remember. I'm happy to bring them again. So you mentioned one of the existing gaps in the historiography, and that is how the constitution was received and perceived in the provinces. So what are the other major gaps in the historiography on this topic? If you could highlight that to us, that's first. So the Armenian constitutional movement goes back at least one century back to the 1770s. So I wonder whether that constitutional movement was somehow reflected in the discourse at that time, or it was completely forgotten in the Ottoman Empire. You were using the word constitutionalists. I wonder whether that was a collective self-naming, or you just use them for the sake of clarity of your analysis. How were they categorizing themselves in the 1860s? The other question, just to continue what Tigran was saying, what were the long-term social implications on the social fabric in the Ottoman Empire on the Armenians? How, the way I understood, you present it as it sort of undermined the existing cracks and divisions within the Armenian community. This is the right conclusion that I have. And the last point is you have presented documents from the other from Sebastian. I wonder whether the archives helped you also to get from other provinces about are they rich enough? How, to what extent have you been able to use these documents from the Ottoman Empire, the letters and?
You mean Ottoman documents?
Yes, so Armenian Ottoman petitions that were sent to the Patriarch or to local governors.
Okay, I'll start with the question of the documents. Yes, to answer it shortly, we do have a lot of other documents for the other provinces. I've looked at a few provinces that I have a lot of documents on the province of Van, where the Catholical state of Ottoman is also residing, and it actually introduced another layer to this already complicated system, so that's why I didn't really go into the details of Van, but we do have a lot of documents on Van. I guess we should understand the existence of these documents as a reflection of the constitutional system itself. So the more you actually go into the 1870s, or late 1860s, early 1870s, the more, the larger is the number of documents that you have about these constitutional institutions, elections, reports, because the system was already getting organized at that time. So by 1890s, of course, there was Armenian censorship, but by 1890s, you barely have anything that resembles the documents of 1860s, 70s, and 80s. So that itself is a reflection of how the system was already declining or collapsing, because these councils, these local councils, were not really operational at the time. Either they were targeted by revolutionaries, either they were banned by the National Assembly. And there was a strong Armenian censorship on the publication of the decisions of the National Assembly, the Civic Council, and the Religious Council in the newspapers themselves. So that, in terms of the documents. The categories they used is Samanataran, so that's how I translate it as constitutional. Samanataran Kalkir, Samanataran Khorner, Samanataran Khozati Konstantinov. So these are some of the kind of common terms that we see. As for the influence of the 18th century, the Madras Armenian, the Borokite Paras on this movement, I wouldn't really say it had a major impact. I'm not even sure if it had an impact at all, because I'm not sure how widespread the Madras school on a potential Armenian, let's say, constitution was how far they actually reached in terms of their audience. So I wouldn't really be surprised if no such impact actually existed on the Ottoman, let's say, Armenian community. As far as the gaps in the historiography, I would say there are two major gaps. First is the gap that I talked about on how the Constitution itself was practiced or implemented or not implemented or misimplemented. So I tried to actually suggest a framework to answer that question. But of course, we do have a lot of work that relates how the National Assembly actually appealed to the British and the French. So there is some work on the Armenian question and its relation to the National Assembly. And that's something that really impacted the radicalization of the Armenian regime. Because for the Ottoman authorities, the fact that the National Assembly itself was now appealing to the British, to the Russian, to the French, especially after 1878, the Treaty of Berlin, made the National Assembly suspect in the eyes of a kind of radicalizing regime. So that's why the National Assembly became one of the first targets for Abdulhamid when he actually wanted to enforce some form of a policy on the Patriarch himself. Because the National Assembly itself was limiting the power of the Patriarch. So we do have a lot of documents saying the National Assembly should be banned, the National Assembly is not legal, the legality of the National Assembly is in question. So for the Ottoman authorities, any form of constitutional checks, any form of constitutional government was a liability that should be removed. The second gap is, I would say, in the historiography or the history of the Armenian revolutionary movement. We do have a lot of books, articles on the revolutionaries, but the fact that there's one or two very limiting framework that usually historians look through at the Armenian revolutionary movement really limits our understanding of how these people, the average, let's say, revolutionary, operated within his or her immediate environment, how he or she actually connected to these notables, how he or she connected to the Ottoman imperial offices. So we don't have much, let's say, work in that sense, because most works on the Armenian revolutionary movements usually focus or take as primary sources the writings of the founders, so the elite, usually intellectual kind of debates, ideology-oriented writings. And second, if we look at it from the Turkish perspective, the Ottoman state perspective, they usually looked at revolutionaries as anti-state, as anarchists, as conspirators. So there is no middle ground. It's either everyone is ideologically it's very ideology-oriented for Armenian freedom, Armenian, let's say, independence, or they are either conspirators, anarchists, or anti-states. But we don't really have a middle ground as to how we can understand these revolutionaries as really part of the Ottoman larger political fabric, because these people were part of the larger political fabric. They were not aliens coming from other areas. Of course, there were many Caucasians coming from Caucasus, from Iran, but they did impact local Ottoman environment, political and social environment. So I guess my call will be to look to other forms of sources that kind of reflect the local organization of these committees, and not only the intellectual debates, but let's say people like Christoph or Mikhailian, or people who were publishing in Drosha or Hinchab were having at the time.
Are you covering that somehow?
Yes, I mean, I have two chapters that in the dissertation that really try to understand local organization of these committees in Sebastian and in Van.
So you're discussing two provinces?
I would say, I wouldn't really consider Constantinople as a province, but I also look at Istanbul to have a kind of...
All right. Other questions, remarks, comments? Okay, in that case, let me just conclude now. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark. I guess we all enjoyed this very interesting discussion. Do we have the date of when it was adopted? On which months, which?
I guess the 1863 version was accepted on May 24 or March. I always confuse between the two.
Why I'm saying, because it's an important landmark in our history. So it's just, I guess you remember some years ago when Armenia's former president used the wrong date when he referred to this constitution. So anyway, so I guess this is an important topic, and we're all very much looking forward to reading the manuscript itself and the book. So we want you to wish you all the success, Mark, and it will be. Just let us know when you defend the dissertation so that we celebrate it. Okay. Thank you very much, and once again, all the best to you.
Բայց հայերը 63-ին է, մարտ 17-ն, 60-ի դրաֆտը, մայիս 24-ն է, դրամը հայերը միշտ մայիսին է նշում։
Հետարքի է, որ կարող եմ նշում եք, չգիտեմ, օրինակ մեր սահմանությունը հուլիսի 5-ին է նշում, բայց այդ է, էլի, որասած է ջույսում եք, որասած է։ Сказал, ладно, նյութեր հիմա ամեն պերսոնով էլ բանում։
Սպիրտում մի բան նշում է։ 60-ական, 70-ական են, այն սոմա արդեն դերացել է։
Շատ ու դեպի ապրես։
Do we have names like some of the research